Good afternoon, everyone. Friday, March 14th. I want to talk to you about a couple things today. First, a little bit of work that's happening behind the scenes because not everything we do makes it out into the public. So just want to catch up on a bit on that. I want to talk about the two notices of motion that I'm bringing. So they both went to executive committee last week, and they will come to council for debate on Tuesday. And especially I want to talk about the roadside naturalization one because lots of confusion, we'll call it confusion, about what naturalization means. So I'm going to get to that, but let's first just talk about a couple behind the scenes things that we're always working on. So we're working on parking issues, always working on parking issues somewhere. Specifically, we're working on some parking issues in Windsor Park. And just trying to address some residents in a busy area, which is great. So it's busy, businesses are great, but it does bring cars. And so it does implicate residents. So just how do we get everyone to do the right thing? And a lot of it is courier drivers. And so how do we get courier drivers to respect and follow the rules? And I don't know the answer to that, but it is definitely a thing. And we actually hear often Skip drivers, Uber Eats drivers, Amazon drivers, they are problematic. And I don't know that answer, but it is something that I am thinking that we really need to start exploring. So a couple things there. We are doing some behind the scenes stuff. So there are some changes that are happening. So we need to create some better water storage, water redundancy, and there's some upgrades basically happening at the Glenmore Water Treatment Center. And so as a result of that, the Glenmore Velodrome and Safety City have to move. And so working with those two groups on what that looks like and really working in concert with administration. So these are administration-led processes for individuals and for groups that are on, not individuals, for groups that are on city leased land. Part of the reason we have this land as a city is because we know we're going to need it for future use. And so in the interim, we lease land. And so when we look at the number of people who are on city leased land, a lot of it is interim. And generally, these are written into the contracts that at any time, if we need them for city services or city delivery, we get the rights to do that. Now, in the case of this, we have a project, and we give as much notice as we possibly can. And so in the case of Safety City, we are talking about we need to make sure you can operate all the way through this season, and then, how do we find a spot? I think it's also really important to remember we don't just say, hey, go find your own spot again. We work with them where possible to try to find a new location and always looking and always having conversations. So in the case of Safety City, it's hey, can we talk with CPS? Do they have somewhere they can co-locate, or fire or mobility? What are the options? And, what can we do? And so that's an in-kind service. If you hired a realtor to go help you find a business spot, you would pay for that service. But our real estate development services, we provide that service for free to these groups to try to help find them a location. And we are often well ahead of it and trying, nothing ever happens last minute. So doing a lot of that work. And there was one more I was going to mention, and I can't remember. And then I think for me, a lot of behind the scenes work on some policy review that is happening. So one of the big projects that's happening this year is making sure, and all councillors are actually working on this, is we're doing a procedure bylaw update. So that's a big deal, and that's a big piece of work happening with clerks. And then the second piece is just getting ready for council, both onboarding and offboarding, on the processes that need to happen through that, and any of the policy changes, but also the schedule of orientation. And so as councillors, we are all very actively involved in advising on that to make sure any new or incoming councillors have a great onboarding. We take our learnings from when we came. And then, for those who are leaving, what do they need for offboarding? Yeah, so lots of policy and procedure updates. One of the other big ones that I've been really actively involved in. So Councillor Putin's, we know, left. And so what is the work that needs to be done there? Because we didn't have a great policy on what happens to staff, what happens to the division of responsibilities. So working on that. And the other thing that has come out there is if you had a counselor who did need to take a medical or bereavement leave, how do you support that? Because there's actually no provisions for it. So we have provisions for parental or maternity leave, but not medical or bereavement leave. And that also requires a change in the Municipal Government Act, which means I've been working with our teams and connecting our intergovernmental affairs teams, our council services teams with municipal affairs, because we know there are some changes that are going to be coming to the Municipal Government Act this year. And so if they're opening it up, if they can make that little tweak in there, it would be really, really fantastic. And so a lot of that work is wrapped up around even just the changes in the Municipal Government Act and the Local Authorities Election Act in advance of the fall election. And that's work I'm doing also with Alberta municipalities. So these are a lot of behind the scenes things that you might think like doesn't affect you as a resident, but they do affect you as a resident, because these are the checks and balances and the policies and the guidelines that surround and essentially give the belts and braces to how we get to operate as a council, and what are the rules that we get to operate in as a council. And so I'll take Local Authorities Election Act. With the introduction of parties into a system, there are currently no reporting requirements for parties, or the reporting requirements for parties are different than if you were just running as an individual. And so one of the reasons the Local Authorities Election Act and the Municipal Government Act is getting open is so that there's like alignment. And that has come out of advocacy from, mostly Edmonton and Calgary, but actually all municipalities are looking at this. The other big one is recall legislation. So what are the parameters for recall legislation? What needs to happen? There's nothing specific around fundraising or reporting on fundraising. And so with Alberta municipalities, we're advising on that. So that's just one. And then that's just one piece of many sort of advocacy pieces I'm doing with Alberta municipalities. But it does affect how individuals or residents at large interact with elected officials. And so having really good, clear understanding and rules and policies around that is super important. And this is where the governance steward in me lives. Okay, let's talk about notices of motion. I am talking quick today because I want to get through everything in 15 minutes, because I have a call to get back on at 12:45 pretty promptly. So I want to talk about inclusive hiring first. So inclusive hiring, so this is really specifically to say that there are individuals with intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities who have the capacity to do jobs within the organizations, but our current hiring process may not be tailored to them, or we don't have accommodations in the hiring process that applies to them. So yes, this is part of equity, inclusion, and diversity and belonging in a workplace. These are strategies that council has given direction to, has approved. And so these are opportunities for us to look bigger and broader at our community as a whole, and to understand how we create inclusive hiring opportunities. I have heard from a number of individuals who have children in this area, who are personally in this area. And how do we ensure that we are creating an equitable work environment so people who are capable of doing jobs, that we get them into employment, and knowing that not everyone has the same access and the same ability to apply for jobs, and for a number of different reasons. And we know that inclusive employers, there's overall a better work culture. And we have people who are very excited to work because we are creating those opportunities. So that's the big one. Or that's not the big one. Well, it is a big one. It is actually really big. It's super big. And in a time when we are talking about merit, and equity, diversity, and inclusion, and why those strategies matter, it's actually a really timely and important time to be having this conversation. And I think really understanding again why EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, was brought in the first place. In the first place is because not we, just the city, but writ large, employers were actually favoring individuals who didn't have the knowledge and experience over minoritized individuals or racialized individuals who did have that, but who were being passed over because of, preferential treatment, old boys club, who do you know, do you qualify, all of the, and that is why equity, diversity, inclusion strategies actually came in the first place, was because there were people who were meeting minimum qualifications or exceeding minimum qualifications who weren't able to gain employment, and people who actually didn't meet them were still getting employment. And that still happens in a lot of workplaces. So that is really important too. And it's always, I think, also important to remember that experience or qualifications aren't necessarily just degrees. I don't know what you all remember from university 20 plus years ago, or not. And maybe you use some things and maybe you don't. but that equivalency is also a really important in the workplace. So just bringing that forward. So that's that. Let's talk about naturalization. I have 5 minutes left. Let's be clear. Naturalization is not just letting the weeds grow. In fact, just letting the weeds grow is the problem. And it is the problem that we are facing on our roadsides. So if you go to any of our older roads, and I'm going to pick on Crowchild and Glenmore, if you actually got really up close with the turf that is there, the grass that is there, you would see that it is riddled with weeds. A lot of the species that are starting to invade that, they grow faster than our mowing cycles. And so we are actually just mowing weeds. We're not mowing anything that's offering any ecological benefit. The soil is in really poor condition. So it's not helping with drought resilience. It's also not helping with flood mitigation. So if you actually have a roadside that cannot, because the soil is so bad, if that soil cannot capture water and help like any rain, it all slips off and it all overflows and all overwhelms our stormwater system. And so when you actually have naturalized roadways in a heavy rainfall, it would actually be able to better capture a ton of that rainfall before it all just like goes into our stormwater system. So it acts as flood resilience. Now it also acts as drought resilience because those native species, they have much longer roots. So so if you've ever dug up sod, you will know Kentucky blue, the roots are like about this big. Just think about dandelions. How big are their roots? Super deep. A lot of our native grass species or our shrubs and our bushes also have incredibly deep roots and they permeate a lot further. And when they take over the soil, they stabilize it. They can hold groundwater. So that's drought resilience, but they also choke out those invasive species. So even if we just think about dandelions, and dandelions are an invasive species, yes, the greens are lovely. Yes, the bees love them, but not always necessarily like native bee. Well, I guess native bee species, but there are much better species like for our ecology, for our pollinators, and pollinators are our bees and our birds and our butterflies. So that is that. Now, I've heard the concerns about fire. So I have met with fire on this. Fire is on board with this. Why? Again, if you have a roadside that is actually better capturing rainwater, is more naturalized, and it can actually be more fire resistant than a single species, especially a single invasive species. Those single invasive species, that is the fire risk because they're highly flammable material. When you have mixed species and diverse species, it's not as flammable and they can act as barriers. Now, some places you don't want it running wild. Absolutely. There's going to need to be things like shoulder cuts that happen. So that's like a 3 to 6 meter strip that you do mow. So if someone is flicking their cigarette butt, which is like, let's be clear what the problem is. The problem is not the plants. The problem is the people. I want to use a stronger word. I won't. The people who are flicking their cigarette butts. Yeah, I know people are lazy and not smart, but ultimately they're the issue, not the plants. Let's like place our frustration and anger where it really belongs. The people who are not acting, with respect for our city. But you can do shoulder cuts, or so also like, right, if someone had to pull off to the side of the road and like leave their car running for some reason, the heat from the car wouldn't necessarily spark a fire. So there's lots of things. There's lots of ways to do this that maintain safety, maintain sight lines, right, as you're coming around a corner. So there's lots of ways. Again, right place, right time, right location. The direction is to create the strategy to do this. So not necessarily go right away and go do all of this. It's to create the strategy to do this. It asks for community input. It asks for community involvement. And so that will be there. I also think the real benefit to this is it's a long-term strategy. There are cost savings. We know there are proven cost savings that can happen through this. And there are, and then all the ecological benefits and plus like the drought and the flood resistance and all of the other good things. And these are all things that we are working towards. So we know our summers are hotter and drier, right? We know our winters are hotter and drier, but we have to be prepared for these things. We have to adapt. And so adaptation is the name of the game. This is what this proposes. And it is... it's a path forward that a lot of other municipalities are looking at and taking. Edmonton's been a leader on this, and we have a real opportunity. And lastly, I will say, when I think about naturalization and the number of species that we could use, I think of even just like the Alberta rose, the prairie rose, the wild rose, who like that is not ugly. Like us a roadside full of roses in June or July, and then like the beautiful red rose hips that like come in the winter time. Like that to me is stunning. And I know I'm a nature lover through and through. But when we think about like the beauty of our roadsides, blue flax, buffalo beans are this like bright, beautiful yellow flower, even some thistles that are like this beautiful purple that like the bees just absolutely adore. We have some amazing species. Some of our clovers are spectacular will offer like color and like just the sort of like aesthetic variety on the sides of a road as opposed to like dry, and they're greener for longer. Like our roadsides turn brown just like that again because there's just like it's just so dead. It's really like our roadsides are dead. So like a green lush landscape full of like native species are really fantastic in my mind. And if you don't love it, that's okay. That's okay. If you want golf course sides of our roads, that's okay. It's going to cost us a ton more money, but it's okay if you want that. Happy Friday, everybody. Have the best one. Get outside, see what's possible, listen to the birds sing, and have a good one.